Agnes Bell did not look at the money, not the estate papers, not the polished silver pen lying beside them, not the 3 Whitaker children staring at her as if she had just committed a crime by staying poor. She stood at the far end of the long oak table in her black maid's dress, both hands folded in front of her, her gray hair pinned so tightly it made her face look sharper than it was. Behind her, rain slid down the tall windows of the Whitaker mansion in thin, trembling lines. The lawyer cleared his throat. "Mrs. Bell," he said carefully, "you understand what you are refusing." Agnes looked at the empty chair at the head of the table. Harold Whitaker's chair. The chair no one had dared move since the funeral. "I understood him for 38 years, she said. "That was enough." Grant Whitaker laughed first. It was not a real laugh. It was the kind rich men used when something frightened them, and they wanted the room to believe they were entertained. "Well, this is dramatic," Grant said, leaning back in his tailored navy suit. "She wants us to beg. That's what this is." His sister Celia pressed a hand to her pearls. Martin, the youngest, kept looking at the floor. Agnes did not answer. "The lawyer, mister." Rowe adjusted his glasses and turned one page of the will. "I need everyone in this room to understand the condition clearly," he said. "Mr. Whitaker's instructions are legally binding. If Mrs. Agnes Bell refuses the inheritance, the estate cannot be distributed to any beneficiary." Grant's smile disappeared. Celia blinked. "What does that mean?" "It means, mister," Rowe said, "the homes, accounts, voting shares, and family trust will remain frozen." "For how long?" Grant asked. Mr. Rowe looked at Agnes. "Until Mrs. Bell either accepts her portion or dies." The room went quiet. Even the rain seemed to pause against the glass. Agnes reached into the pocket of her apron and took out something small. A brass key, dulled with age, tied to a piece of faded blue ribbon. Martin noticed it first. His face changed. Grant did not. He slammed his palm on the table. "This is insane. She cleaned our floors." Agnes finally turned to him. "No," she said softly. "I cleaned what your family spilled." And that was when Celia Whitaker, who had not prayed in 20 years, whispered, "Oh God," because she knew the key. And because Agnes Bell, for the first time in 38 years, was no longer standing where they had put her. She was standing where Harold Whitaker had left her. In judgment. The Whitaker mansion had been built to make people feel small. Its front hall rose 2 stories high, with a chandelier that scattered light across marble floors. The portraits on the walls showed men in dark suits and women in pearls, each face painted with the same expression. Ownership disguised as dignity. Agnes had walked those floors since she was 27. She knew which stair groaned in winter. She knew which window leaked in a hard storm. She knew where Harold Whitaker hid his blood pressure pills, where Celia used to cry after school, where Grant once broke a crystal vase and blamed the gardener's boy. She knew too much. That was why, after Harold died, they had expected her to vanish. At the funeral, Grant had handed her an envelope in the servants' hallway, not even looking at her. "Severance," he said. "Father would have wanted you comfortable." Agnes had opened it later at the bus stop. Inside was a check for 3 months' wages and a note typed by someone else. "Thank you for your years of loyal service." Loyal. That word had followed her home like a bad smell. Now 2 weeks later, the same family sat around the same table, and the lawyer had just told them their fortune was trapped behind the decision of the woman they had tried to dismiss. Celia's voice shook. "Mr. Rowe, there must be some alternative." "There is no alternative written into the document." Grant stood. "Then challenge it." "We can try," Mr. Rowe said. "But your father anticipated that." He opened a second folder. Agnes kept her eyes on the rain. Mr. Rowe read aloud. "If any heir contests the authority of Agnes Bell, that heir shall forfeit all direct claim to my estate and shall be removed from any advisory position in the Whitaker Foundation." Grant's face flushed. He was not in his right mind. "He signed the will 11 months ago, Mr. Rowe said, after 2 independent evaluations. Celia looked at Agnes then, really looked at her, perhaps for the first time that day. Her gaze fell to the brass key in Agnes's hand. "You still have that?" Agnes closed her fingers around it. Grant snapped toward his sister. "What is it?" Celia swallowed. "Nothing," Martin whispered. "It's not nothing." Agnes turned toward the door. "Mr. Rowe said Mrs. Bell, before you leave, I am required to ask one final time today. Do you accept the inheritance as written? Agnes put the brass key on the table. It landed with a small sound. No. Then she walked out. Behind her, Grant shouted her name, not with respect, but panic. She did not stop. Not in the hall. Not at the front door. Not when Martin called, "Agnes, please." She stepped into the rain without an umbrella. For 38 years, she had entered that house through the side door. That afternoon, she left through the front. Agnes Bell lived in a small rented house at the edge of town, where the porch boards sagged and the kitchen window faced a narrow strip of wild grass. There were no portraits on her walls, no crystal bowls, no polished clocks, only a framed photograph of a young man in a work shirt, smiling like the world had not yet shown him its teeth. His name was Thomas, her son. Every morning, Agnes wiped dust from the frame with the corner of her sleeve, not because there was much dust, but because it gave her hands something gentle to do. The day after the will reading, she found Grant Whitaker waiting outside her gate. He had not come alone. His driver sat in a black car by the curb, engine running. Grant held a leather folder under his arm and wore the same expression he once wore at 19, when he had ordered Agnes to scrub mud from his riding boots while his friends watched. "Mrs. Bell," he said, forcing politeness around her name like a too small glove. Agnes unlocked her door. Grant followed her up the walk without being invited. "I don't know what my father promised you," he said, "but this situation is bad for everyone." Agnes opened the door and stepped inside. Grant stopped at the threshold. It seemed to disturb him that there was no one there to announce him. "I can make this simple," he said. "Accept the inheritance. Transfer management control back to the family. Keep whatever amount you think is fair." Agnes turned. "What amount would clean a floor twice?" Grant frowned. "Excuse me? You said once I had missed a spot by the west stairs. I cleaned it again. You still stepped on it before it dried." He stared at her, annoyed. "Are we really discussing childhood nonsense?" "No," Agnes said. "We are discussing habit." Grant's jaw tightened. He opened the folder and placed a paper on her small kitchen table. "A private agreement. You sign the estate acceptance, then sign this. You'll receive $2 million immediately." Agnes looked at the paper. $2 million. A number so large it almost became meaningless. She thought of the winter Thomas needed dental surgery, and Harold Whitaker had said he would see what could be arranged, then forgot. She thought of boiling potatoes 3 nights in a row, while polishing silver spoons worth more than her rent. Grant mistook her silence for temptation. $2 million, he repeated. For a signature. Agnes walked to the sink and rinsed a teacup. Grant looked around her kitchen with poorly hidden disgust. "You can't tell me you prefer this." Agnes dried the cup. "I prefer knowing what belongs to me." "You're being used by a dead man," Grant snapped. At that, Agnes smiled faintly. "No, I was used by him alive." Grant's confidence flickered. But before he could answer, a second car pulled up outside. Celia Whitaker stepped out, holding a white umbrella though the rain had stopped. She saw Grant through the window and hurried in without knocking. "Grant, don't bully her. I'm solving a problem. You are the problem half the time." Celia turned to Agnes. Her voice softened in a way Agnes did not trust. "Mrs. Bell, Agnes, I came to apologize for yesterday. It was emotional." Agnes set the cup on the shelf. "Funerals are emotional. Wills are revealing." Celia flinched. She was 53 now, but Agnes could still see the 13-year-old girl who used to stand in the pantry eating jam from a spoon because her mother had told her. Ladies did not ask for second helpings. Celia had not been born cruel. That was what made her harder to hate. Celia's eyes moved to the photograph on the wall. "Thomas," she said quietly. Agnes's face closed. Grant looked between them. "What does her son have to do with this?" Celia said nothing. Agnes took the brass key from her pocket and placed it beside Thomas's photograph. Celia went pale. Grant saw it. "What is that key?" Agnes answered. "Ask your sister." Celia's mouth trembled. It opened the blue cabinet in Father's study. Grant frowned. "The one he kept locked?" "Yes." "What was in it?" Celia looked at Agnes, then away. Agnes picked up the key. "Things men keep when they are too ashamed to burn them." That evening, Martin came alone. No driver, no folder, no umbrella. He knocked once and stood back from the door like a man expecting to be turned away. Agnes almost did, but when she opened it, Martin Whitaker looked so much like the boy who used to leave orange peels in his pockets that for one foolish second she felt tired instead of angry. "I'm not here to ask you to sign," he said. "That makes one of you. I'm here because I think I know why you won't." Agnes said nothing. Martin's eyes were red. Whether from grief or fear, she could not tell. "My father asked for you before he died," he said. "The night before." He kept saying, "Tell Agnes I should have opened the cabinet sooner." Agnes gripped the doorframe. That phrase, "opened the cabinet sooner." Harold had said it once before, 21 years earlier, on the worst night of Agnes's life. The night Thomas was accused. The night the Whitaker diamond brooch disappeared from Celia's engagement party. The night every guest pretended not to stare while a young black houseman, a gardener, and Agnes's son were made to empty their pockets in the back hall. Thomas had been 22, working extra shifts to help his mother. The brooch was found in his coat. He swore he had never seen it before. Grant said. "Thieves always swear," Celia cried. "Not for Thomas, for the scandal." Harold Whitaker stood in the doorway with his hand on the blue cabinet key and said nothing. Thomas was not arrested that night because Agnes begged. Harold handled it privately, as he called it. But Thomas lost his job, his references, his chance at a training program Harold had promised to sponsor. The town heard enough. A young man could survive hunger better than suspicion. Thomas left 6 months later. He died 8 years after that, far from home in a rented room, with his mother's last letter unopened on the table. Agnes had buried him with the photograph she liked least, because it was the only one where he still looked unbroken. Martin whispered, "Agnes, did my father know Thomas didn't take it?" Agnes looked at him for a long moment. Then she closed the door. Not because he did not deserve an answer, because he did, and she was not ready to give him the mercy of hearing it. By the third day, the Whitakers stopped pretending this was private. Grant called an emergency family meeting at the mansion and invited Mr. Rowe, 2 financial advisors, and a reputation consultant who wore soft gray and spoke in words polished clean of meaning. Agnes was not invited. She came anyway, not through the front door this time, through the side entrance. Old habits could be useful when people forgot who knew the house. She stood just outside the library and listened. Grant's voice carried. "She's unstable. We build the case. Emotional resentment, possible coercion by father, maybe mental decline." Celia said, "She is not unstable. She refused enough money to buy 10 lives. That does not make her unstable. It makes her angry." The consultant asked, "Is there any history that could explain hostility toward the family?" Silence. Then Grant said she was staff. Staff always imagine things. Agnes's fingers tightened around the laundry room key she still carried by habit. Mr. Rowe spoke sharply. "Be careful, Mr. Whitaker." Grant ignored him. "Find every record. Wages, complaints, disciplinary notes. If father put her in the will under guilt, we show she manipulated that guilt." Martin said, "She didn't manipulate anyone." Grant laughed. "Now you're defending her." "I'm remembering. That will be a first." Agnes pushed the library door open. Every head turned. Grant rose from his chair. "How did you get in?" "With keys your family forgot to ask back." The reputation consultant gave her a sympathetic smile that did not reach her eyes. "Mrs. Bell, perhaps this is an emotional time for all parties." Agnes looked at her. "Parties are where this began." Celia lowered her gaze. Grant stepped forward. "Fine. You want an audience? Let's have one. Tell us your price." Agnes walked to the long table and placed 3 objects on it. A faded blue ribbon, the brass key, and an old pay envelope. Grant stared. "What is this performance?" Agnes opened the envelope and slid out a yellowed slip. "My last wage statement from the week after Celia's engagement party." Mr. Rowe leaned forward. Agnes continued, $21 docked for household damages. I asked what damages. "Your father said it was better not to discuss unpleasant things," Celia whispered. "I didn't know." "No," Agnes said. "You didn't ask." Grant snatched the slip, glanced at it, and tossed it back. "You're basing this circus on a paycheck from decades ago." Agnes turned to Martin. "You were 16. You were in the pantry when Grant came in with Celia's brooch." Martin's face drained. Grant froze. Celia looked at him. What? Martin could barely speak. I saw him with something. I didn't know what it was, Grant exploded. You little coward. Celia stood so fast her chair scraped the floor. You had the brooch? Grant pointed at Agnes. She's poisoning you. This is exactly what she wants. Agnes did not raise her voice. I want nothing from you. That's a lie, Grant said. You want us humiliated. You want us punished for every imagined slight. Agnes looked at him with a coldness that made the room shrink. Imagined? Grant reached into his folder and pulled out copies of old staff reports. You were warned 3 times for insubordination. Here, Father documented it. Refusing direct instruction. Speaking disrespectfully. Leaving early. Agnes looked at the papers. She remembered each one. Refusing direct instruction. She had refused to serve wine to Harold's drunk friend after he touched a kitchen girl's waist. Speaking disrespectfully. She had told Grant not to call Thomas a boy. Leaving early, she had gone to the hospital when Thomas broke his hand. Grant smiled. This is who you are, bitter, difficult. Always thinking rules don't apply to you, Martin whispered. Grant, stop. No. She has held this family hostage long enough. Then Grant did the thing none of them expected. He walked around the table, dropped to one knee in front of Agnes and looked up at her with hatred shining behind his eyes. There, he said. Is this what you wanted? The rich man's son on his knees? Please, Mrs. Bell. Please accept the money. Celia covered her mouth. The consultant looked horrified, not morally but professionally. Agnes stared down at Grant. For a moment, everyone thought she might break. Instead, she bent slightly and picked a piece of lint from his shoulder, just as she had done when he was a boy before church. You never did know the difference, she said, between kneeling and humbling yourself. Then she walked to Harold's portrait over the fireplace. The painted Harold looked younger, stronger, sure of himself. Agnes took the brass key and held it up. Open the blue cabinet. Grant stood. No, mister. Rose said. Actually, mister. Whitaker, your father left instructions regarding that cabinet. He removed a sealed envelope from his case. Grant's eyes flashed. You knew? I knew there were instructions, Mr. Rowe said. I was not authorized to open them unless Mrs. Bell requested it in the presence of all 3 heirs. Agnes's hand trembled slightly. Not enough for most people to see. Martin saw. Celia saw. Grant saw too and mistook it for weakness. He moved toward the door. This meeting is over. Agnes spoke without turning. The brooch was never stolen. The room stopped. Grant's hand remained on the doorknob. Agnes said, It was hidden, Celia whispered. By whom? Agnes looked at Grant. But the answer that came next was not his name. It was Harold's. The blue cabinet stood in Harold Whitaker's private study, behind a wall panel disguised by built-in shelves. For years, guests had admired that room. The leather chairs, the globe bar, the old maps, the shelves of books Harold rarely read but liked owning. Agnes had dusted the room every Tuesday. She had never opened the cabinet. Not because she lacked the key. Harold had given it to her 3 months before his death with a hand that shook. Keep it, he had said. Why? In case I lose my nerve. He had tried to smile. Agnes had not. Now, mister. Rowe, Celia, Grant, Martin, and Agnes stood in the study while rain tapped against the windows. Grant's voice was low. This is absurd. No one answered. Agnes inserted the key. The lock resisted at first, then clicked. Inside were 4 items: a velvet pouch, a stack of letters tied with twine, a small ledger, and a cassette tape in a clear plastic case labeled in Harold's handwriting, Kitchen Hall. June 14. Celia began to cry before anyone touched it. Because June 14 was the night of her engagement party. Mr. Rowe put on cotton gloves. We proceed carefully. Grant backed away. This proves nothing. Agnes looked at him. You haven't seen it yet, mister. Rowe opened the velvet pouch. Inside lay Celia's diamond brooch. The same brooch that had supposedly been found in Thomas Bell's coat 21 years earlier. Celia made a sound like someone had pressed the air from her lungs. Martin leaned against the desk. Grant said, That could be a duplicate. Agnes said, Your mother had the clasp repaired in April that year. There's a small notch behind the second stone. Celia reached for it, then stopped. Mister. Rowe examined it. The notch is there, first crack. Grant looked at Celia. You can't seriously believe. Mr. Rowe opened the ledger. The room seemed to tilt around Agnes, though she stood still. The ledger contained names, dates, payments, and notes in Harold's precise hand. Staff adjustments, discretionary settlements, private corrections. On one page, June 15, 21 years earlier, A. Bell Dock 21 must remain quiet. T. Bell dismissed, no reference. GW incident contained C. W. Reputation preserved. Celia whispered. GW Grant said nothing. Martin closed his eyes, denial. Grant shook his head. Father wrote all kinds of notes. That doesn't mean what you think it means. Mr. Rowe untied the letters. The first was addressed to Agnes. It had never been mailed. Mr. Rowe offered it to her. Agnes did not take it. Read it, she said. Mr. Rowe unfolded the paper. His voice changed as he read Harold's words. Agnes, I have written this apology many times and destroyed every version, because words are easier when no one can answer them. Your son did not steal Celia's brooch. Grant took it in anger after I threatened to remove him from the company training program. He placed it in Thomas's coat to create a distraction, and I allowed the accusation to stand because I was afraid of scandal, afraid of my own son, and more concerned with the Whitaker name than with Thomas Bell's life. Celia covered her face. Grant shouted, "He was sick when he wrote that," Mr. Rowe continued. I told myself I had spared Thomas worse by not calling the police. That was the lie I used to sleep. The truth is, I let a young man leave my house marked as a thief. I watched his mother continue serving meals to the people who had ruined him. Agnes stood perfectly still. Inside her, something old tore open without making noise. Second proof, Mr. Rowe lifted the cassette. Your father's instructions say this should be played if the written statement is challenged. Grant's face went gray. No. Celia looked at him slowly. What are you afraid of? Grant's mouth opened, but no sound came out, Mr. Rowe found an old tape player in the cabinet, as if Harold had planned even the cruelty of convenience. The tape clicked. There was static, then voices, younger, sharper, alive. Grant's voice first. I didn't mean for it to go this far. Harold's voice. Where is the brooch, Grant? I put it where they'd find it, Harold. Where, Grant? In Bell's coat. A chair scraped. Harold cursed under his breath. Grant said, You said I was embarrassing you. You said you'd cut me off. So now you can be busy with the servant boy instead. The room froze around the tape. Harold's voice came again lower. You will tell them you found nothing. Do you understand me? Grant laughed on the recording. And what? Ruin Celia's night? Tell everyone your son framed the maid's son? You won't do it. Silence. Then Harold, barely audible. No, I suppose I won't. Emotional confirmation. The tape clicked off. No one moved. Grant looked smaller than Agnes had ever seen him. Celia turned toward him with a kind of horror that had no room left for politeness. You let Thomas carry that? Grant's face twisted. I was 19. Thomas was 22, Agnes said. Grant snapped. He could have stayed and defended himself. Agnes finally raised her voice. He did. It echoed through the study. Not loud enough to be theatrical. Loud enough to be true. He defended himself until his voice broke. He looked at your father and said, Mr. Whitaker, you know me. And your father looked at the floor. Martin's tears fell silently. Agnes went on. My son did not leave because of the brooch. He left because every face in this house taught him that innocence did not matter if the wrong person needed protecting. Grant looked at Mr. Rowe. This cannot leave this room. Mr. Rowe closed the ledger. It already has legal consequences. Final irreversible truth. But the last proof did not come from the lawyer. It came from Celia. She walked to the cabinet and removed a second letter from the stack. Her name was written on it. She opened it with shaking fingers. She read silently at first, then aloud. Celia, you cried that night because you believed something precious had been stolen from you. I let you keep believing that because it was easier than telling you what your brother had done and what I had failed to do. The brooch was never the most precious thing in that room. A man's name was. Celia sank into the leather chair. For the first time in her life, she looked around her father's study as if it did not belong to her. Martin stepped toward Agnes. I knew Grant had something, he said. I told myself it wasn't the brooch. I told myself father would have fixed it if it mattered. Agnes looked at him. And did that help you sleep? Martin shook his head. No. Grant laughed bitterly. So this is it? We destroy a family over some old staff grievance. Agnes turned toward him. No, Mr. Whitaker. Your family was not destroyed by the truth. It was preserved by a lie until the lie got too expensive. Grant's eyes filled, not with regret, but terror. Please, he said. That word came again. Please. But this time he did not kneel. This time he stood like a man finally understanding the floor beneath him could open. Agnes, he said, if you don't accept, everything freezes. Employees lose jobs. The foundation stops funding programs. My children's trusts. Now you remember consequences, Agnes said. Celia lifted her head. What do you want? Agnes looked at the blue cabinet, at the brooch, at the letters, at the tape, at all the things Harold Whitaker had kept because confession was easier to store than to speak. What I wanted, Agnes said, was for one man to say my son's name while my son was alive to hear it. No one answered, because there are sentences so true they leave no room for reply. The next morning, the Whitaker mansion opened its doors to a meeting no one in the family wanted. Not a press conference. Agnes refused spectacle. She agreed only to a private gathering in the main hall. The current household staff, the family's senior employees, the foundation trustees, Mr. Rowe, and the 3 Whitaker siblings. Grant objected until Mr. Rowe reminded him that contesting Agnes's authority would cost him everything immediately. So Grant stood beneath the chandelier with his hands at his sides, looking like a man wearing someone else's skin. Agnes entered last. She wore the same black dress, but she did not look like staff anymore. Or perhaps she always had looked like more, and the house was only now being forced to notice Mr. Rowe read a formal statement from Harold Whitaker's sealed instructions. It acknowledged misconduct, wrongful dismissal, suppression of evidence, financial punishment, and reputational harm done to Thomas Bell and Agnes Bell. The language was legal, the wound was not. When Thomas's name was spoken aloud in the Whitaker hall, Agnes closed her eyes. Not for long. Just long enough to hear what had been denied. Then Mr. Rowe said, Mrs. Bell has agreed to address the matter of the inheritance. Grant stared at her like a starving man watching a locked pantry. Celia stood beside him, pale and silent. Martin could not lift his eyes. Agnes stepped forward. I have been asked to accept what Mr. Whitaker left me, she said. I have been offered money to make this easy. I have been insulted, doubted, studied, and begged. The staff stood very still. Some had known Agnes for years, others knew only rumors. But everyone understood the sound of power being forced to listen. Agnes continued. I will not accept Harold Whitaker's apology as payment. Apology is not a bill. Grief is not an invoice. My son's name is not for sale. Grant's shoulders dropped. Celia began to cry again quietly. But Agnes said, I will accept the authority he gave me for one purpose. Grant looked up. Agnes turned to Mr. Rowe. The portion assigned to me will be placed in an independent fund under Thomas Bell's name. It will support workers wrongfully dismissed, young adults who lose references because powerful people lie, and families who cannot afford to fight a rich man's version of events. Martin covered his mouth. Celia whispered. Yes, Grant said. You can't, Mr. Rowe interrupted. She can. Agnes looked at Grant. I will not manage your company. I will not live in your house. I will not sit at your table. I will not wear your mother's pearls or ride in your father's cars. Then she looked at Celia. The brooch belongs to you. Keep it or bury it. I don't care. Celia shook her head. No, it doesn't belong to me anymore. She crossed the hall, took the velvet pouch from Mr. Rowe, and placed it on the table in front of Agnes. Agnes did not touch it. Celia whispered, I am sorry. Agnes studied her. For a long time, there was only rain and the old house breathing around them. Finally, Agnes said, I believe you are. Celia's face broke. But belief, Agnes added, is not repair. Celia nodded through tears. Martin stepped forward. I should have spoken. Yes, Agnes said. There was no cruelty in it. That made it worse. Martin nodded. I'll spend the rest of my life knowing that. Grant looked around as if waiting for someone to defend him. No one did. He turned to Agnes, voice low. What do you want from me? Agnes's answer came without hesitation. Nothing. It hit him harder than anger, because anger would have tied them together. Nothing cut the rope. In the weeks that followed, the Whitaker estate did not collapse, though Grant had spoken as if the world would end without his control. It changed. Grant was removed from executive authority after the trustees reviewed Harold's records and Grant's own conduct. He kept enough money to remain comfortable, which to him felt like poverty because comfort without command was a cage. Celia resigned from the foundation board for 1 year and returned only after insisting on outside oversight. She sold the diamond brooch anonymously and donated the proceeds to the Thomas Bell Fund. Though Agnes never asked and never thanked her publicly, Martin visited Agnes once a month. At first, she did not let him inside. He would stand on the porch and tell her what the fund had done. A mechanic's apprentice restored after a false accusation. A hotel worker compensated after being blamed for a missing watch that later turned up in a guest's luggage. A young woman given legal help after an employer tried to ruin her with a whisper. Agnes listened through the screen door. One afternoon in early spring, Martin brought a folder and a small wooden box. Agnes opened the door halfway. "What is that?" "Thomas's references," he said. "The ones my father never sent." Agnes stared. Martin's voice shook. "I found copies in the cabinet records. 3 letters, all signed, all glowing. He wrote them and locked them away." Agnes took the folder. Her hands did not shake until she saw the first line. "To whom it may concern, Thomas Bell is one of the most dependable young men I have known." Agnes sat down on the porch step. Martin remained standing in the yard. She read every word. Dependable, honest, careful, worthy of trust, words that arrived 21 years late. Words Thomas had needed when his shoes still had dust from the Whitaker driveway on them. Agnes pressed the pages against her chest. Martin said, "I'm sorry." Agnes looked at him. "You keep saying that. I know. Say his name instead." Martin swallowed. "Thomas Bell." Agnes closed her eyes. The wind moved through the grass. For the first time in years, the sound did not seem empty. That summer, the Whitaker mansion held one final gathering Agnes agreed to attend. Not for the family, for the fund. A brass plaque had been placed in the renovated servants' entrance, because Agnes refused to let them hide the truth in the grand hall where guests could admire themselves for noticing it. The plaque read, "Thomas Bell Fund, for those whose names were taken before their futures could begin." Below it, in smaller letters, "Justice delayed must not become justice forgotten." Agnes arrived in a plain blue dress, no jewelry, no borrowed wealth. Celia stood near the doorway, but did not approach until Agnes nodded. Martin kept a respectful distance. Grant did not attend. People spoke. Trustees, workers, one young recipient whose voice broke while thanking a man he had never met. Then Agnes was asked if she wanted to say anything. She stepped to the small podium. For a moment, she looked toward the old service corridor. She could almost see Thomas there, young and tired, carrying a tray too carefully because he wanted to prove he belonged in rooms that had already decided he did not. Agnes looked at the crowd. "My son was not a lesson," she said. "He was a person. Be careful when you turn people into lessons. It often means you ignored them when they were alive." The room went silent. She folded her paper without reading the rest. Then she walked to the servants' entrance and touched the plaque with 2 fingers. Not like a woman accepting victory. Like a mother touching a door that should have opened sooner. Outside, the late afternoon sun had broken through the clouds. Agnes stepped down from the mansion porch, past the side path, past the trimmed hedges, past the window where she had once stood waiting to be summoned. At the driveway, Martin offered to call her a car. Agnes shook her head. "I know the way home," and she did. She walked slowly, with the folder of Thomas's letters held under one arm. Behind her, the Whitaker mansion remained large and white and watchful. But for the first time, it looked less like a kingdom, and more like a house that had finally run out of places to hide. Some apologies arrived so late, they can no longer heal what they were meant to repair. Agnes Bell did not refuse the inheritance because she was proud, greedy, or bitter. She refused because she understood something many people spend their lives avoiding. Money can acknowledge harm, but it cannot erase it. A signature can settle an estate, but it cannot give a mother back the years when her son's name was spoken with suspicion. And still Agnes chose not to let pain end only as pain. She turned a dead man's cowardly apology into protection for people still living. Not revenge. Not forgiveness wrapped in a pretty bow. Something harder. Something more useful. Maybe that is the deepest kind of dignity. Not pretending the wound did not matter, and not letting the people who caused it decide what healing should look like. So here is the question worth sitting with. If someone offered you justice after the person you loved was already gone, would you accept it, refuse it, or turn it into something that might save someone else? Share your thoughts in the comments. And if stories about hidden truth, dignity, and quiet justice matter to you, subscribe for more from The Last Truth Stories.